The Boo-Boos That Changed the World, a true story about an accidental invention, really. Once upon a time, in 1917 actually, a cotton buyer named Earl Dixon married his beloved Josephine, and they lived happily ever after. The end. Actually, that was just the beginning. The newlyweds expected to live a quiet life in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Instead, Earl and Josephine ended up changing the world, one boo-boo at a time. You see, Josephine was accident-prone. She often bumped and bruised herself while working round the house. But that was nothing compared to how often she injured herself in the kitchen. Ouch! She sliced and diced an onion. She sometimes sliced her finger, too. Boo-hoo! When she grated cheese, she sometimes grated her knuckle. Arg! When she lifted a hot pot off the stove, she sometimes burned her hand. After Josephine winced in pain, she quickly grabbed a rag to stop the bleeding. But with bulky towels between her fingers, it was even harder for Josephine to hold a knife. She became even more accident-prone. Impossible, you say? It's true. Josephine's klutziness had become a bloody problem. Every night when Earl came home from work, he looked forward to talking with Josephine and eating the wonderful meal she had prepared. That was until he saw his beloved's hands. Yikes! Her cuts might get infected. He had to help his new bride. Earl's father was a doctor, so Earl knew a little bit about boo-boos and bandages. And luckily, he worked for a company that manufactured hospital supplies. Earl knew there had to be a solution, but what was it? Earl thought while he shaved in the morning, maybe if I... Earl thought while he bought cotton in the afternoon, then I could... And Earl thought some more while he lay in bed at night, and that would solve... Finally, a light bulb went off over his head. I've got it! Earl yelled with excitement, waking up Josephine. What have you got? She asked. The bloody solution, of course, Earl replied. The next morning, Earl tried out his idea. Step 1, he took a long piece of adhesive tape and laid it on the kitchen table, sticky side up. Step 2, Earl cut small squares of sterile gauze and stuck them on the tape every few inches. Step 3, he placed a material called crinoline on top of the adhesive tape to keep the whole strip sterile. It's perfect, Earl said proudly. Now all Josephine had to do was cut off a piece of the longer strip and put it on. She didn't need anybody's help. She only needed one hand. It worked! At last, they lived happily ever after. The end. But wait, here comes the part about how Earl and Josephine changed the world. Earl guessed there was probably hundreds, possibly even thousands of people who could benefit from his new invention. Earl and Josephine thought about making the bandages themselves, but they soon realized it was too big a job. Earl told one of his coworkers about it, and the coworker encouraged Earl to meet with the company's president. At first, Earl's boss, James Johnson, wasn't quite sure Earl's idea was good enough. Earl demonstrated how easy it was to put the bandage on. Then Mr. Johnson saw his own light bulb. The company agreed to produce and sell the product. They combined the words bandage and first aid to create the clever name Band-Aid. Now Earl and Josephine would surely live happily ever after because Band-Aids were guaranteed to be instant success. And with that, we have come to the end. Thank you and good night. Oops, not yet. Sorry. That first year, Band-Aids were made in a factory. It was a slower than slow process, and only a small number could be manufactured by hand. They came rolled up and were 18 ridiculous inches long and 3 ridiculous inches wide. They still had to be cut into pieces. Earl, Josephine, and Mr. Johnson had high expectations, but the Band-Aid boxes collected dust, ignored and unwanted. A few years later, the company invented a machine that could mass produce thousands of bandages. Instead of the user having to cut them up, each one was ready to go. Band-Aids were now about 3 inches long and 1 inch wide. They were cute, too. Each one had a little red string to pull in order to open the paper wrapper. Success! Band-Aids flew off the shelves. The end. Not really. Unfortunately, even with the cute red string, the convenient size, the public wasn't sold on the idea. Mr. Johnson knew there had to be a solution. What happened next was truly a stroke of genius. The company decided to give the Band-Aids away. Mr. Johnson wondered who needed self-adhesive bandages most. And then that light bulb went off again. The Boy Scouts, of course. All those fall down, climb up, scratched elbows, scraped knees boys got plenty of cuts. It didn't take long before the mothers of those rough and tumble boys saw how handy these little bandages were. They did it! Earl and Josephine's invention was a smash. During World War II, the company sent millions of free Band-Aids to the brave soldiers fighting overseas. In the years that followed, Band-Aids were made in different sizes, colors, and designs. Some even had pictures of cartoon characters on them. And that continues to this day, all over the world. From boisterous hot dog vendors in Brooklyn, fancy French winemakers, tired taxi drivers in Denmark, and English bobbies on bicycles to daredevil skateboarders in Saskatchewan, king crab fishermen in Alaska, sweaty Ugadan soccer players, and applauding audiences at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, the sounds of "Ay! Wah!" and "Ouch!" echoed still, but not for long. Because soon, those snivels and sobs of pain are silenced by Earl and Josephine's accidental boo-boo invention. And that is the happiest ending of all. The end. Really. Author's note. We don't know exactly what Earl and Josephine said when Earl first figured out his idea for a ready-made bandage. I invented the dialogue and details surrounding the interactions in this book. The Band-Aid is one of those little inventions that nobody thinks about much. You stick one on when you get a boo-boo and continue your way. What is there to ponder? There's a whole lot involved. Every invention has a history. Things don't invent themselves, do they? Then who does? And when? And where? And how? Inventions are invented because they fill a need. Such was the case of the Band-Aid. Josephine needed an easy way to stop the bleeding on her fingers and to make sure her cuts didn't get infected. So Earl combined several ideas that resulted in the invention of the Band-Aid, a bandage that anyone could put on by themselves. It seems like such a simple idea today, but think about all of the elements that came together perfectly. Earl's father was a doctor, so Earl was somewhat familiar with the basics of cleaning cuts. Earl happened to work for a major manufacturer of medical supplies, and Earl's wife was accident-prone. Take any of those three away, we can only wonder if the name Earl Dixon would mean anything to anyone in the world. The world needed small, sterile, adhesive bandages, and they would have been invented eventually. Maybe someday, somebody else at Johnson & Johnson would have came up with the idea a few months or years later. Or a competitor might have thought of them first. Maybe even somebody halfway around the world. Earl was promoted to vice president and eventually elected to Johnson & Johnson's board of directors. He was certainly rewarded with respect from his colleagues and a bigger salary, too. That was good news to the Dixons, who raised 2 boys. Earl died in 1961 when he was 68 years old. He didn't see the variety of designs, shapes, and colors that Band-Aids come in now. Earl had no way of knowing how many companies would also think his idea was great and make their own brand of adhesive bandages. But he did know that his little idea made a big difference in people's lives. The Band-Aid celebrates its 100th anniversary in 2020, And in spite of the global competition today, Band-Aid brand adhesive bandages are still the boo-boo king.